And so it's now my great pleasure to introduce my old friend, Iain, Dr. Iain McGilchrist, who's not speaking from his normal habitat in Skye, but from another island where he's staying with his brother, Nigel, on Kythera. And we had an emergency just before we started because the power went out on the Greek island. And so Iain rang in to say that he didn't have any power. And of course, we were then scrambling around to see whether we could change the order of things around. But luckily, the power came on just in time. And so we have Iain here. Now, Iain will be known, hopefully, to all of you for his extraordinary book, The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World, in which he talks not only about the evidence in neuroscience for the importance of differentiating left and right hemisphere functions in the brain, but also how this is reflected in culture. And he's just finished another huge book, which we're all looking forward to seeing, on taking this argument further. And at the end, I'll just remind people that you can go onto his website, subscribe to his newsletter, and you can also subscribe to the newly created channel McGilchrist, where you'll be able to see some of the films that he's made and podcasts and various other items. And I will be, you'll also have a chance, there's some Galileo Commission podcasts coming up, and one of those is a conversation with Iain. So that's a further opportunity to delve into his work. So Iain, over to you, and we're very relieved to see you.
Thank you, David. Yes, and nobody's more relieved than I am. But we don't know. We're at the mercy of the gods of the winds, because the power may go out again. And I'm a great believer we have to go with the flow, or in this case, the wind. So I hope that we will have an uninterrupted signal. Thank you very much for your introduction. I'm going to talk about matter and consciousness, and it's a difficult topic to cover in 45 minutes, but I do propose to speak for 45 minutes. I've written a much longer address of this subject in the book that David referred to, but as Stuart Sutherland says, you know, nothing worth reading has ever been written about consciousness, so you might as well switch off now, really. People talk about the problem of consciousness, and I always say, what problem? Consciousness is one of the least problematic things we know. But what is matter? Now that is a devilish difficult thing to answer, and I will talk about this and address it from different points of view during the talk. I will also not begin by defining my terms, as one is supposed to do, on the basis that I could talk for at least two lectures of the same length about the different meanings of the word consciousness. You know, what you don't have when you're in a coma, what you're not conscious of because it slipped out of your mind, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to go into all that. I'm going to skip that. And I'm going to say that what I'm talking about are all the activities that go on for each of us, as we say, unconsciously or pre-consciously, as well as consciously, but could not go on without what is conventionally referred to as subjectivity or inwardness of some kind. And I prefer to call that experience. According to one doughty source, our psychological reactions from moment to moment are 99.44% automatic. It's a wonderful left hemisphere declaration, but I think one gets the point. An awful lot of what goes on in our consciousness is not what we're immediately conscious of. So only a tiny part of our psychological, our mental life enters our full consciousness so as to form a subject of reflection, that of which we are aware. I'm not going to talk much about hemispheres. There is quite a lot that could be said in relation to this, but I'm just going to say that one way of thinking about what we call the sort of self-conscious consciousness is that it is a very narrow beam of attention, which is typical of the left hemisphere. It pays a very narrow beam of attention, probably about 3 degrees of the whole 360-degree circle of available attention in all modalities. And in this sense, it's rather like a spotlight that moves around a stage. whatever is in the spotlight is immediately visible, and what is not in the spotlight is not. But it's not as though the stuff that's not in the spotlight goes away. It's just as real, and it will have its turn in the spotlight at some stage. So really all we're talking about is what we're immediately conscious of. And it would be a bold person to say that if I were, like David, able to play an organ fugue, the fact that I couldn't possibly be conscious of the movements of my fingers and my legs, I could only be conscious at most of the movements of one finger, which would stop me playing altogether, that I'm not playing it, or I'm not a conscious being when I'm playing it. Well, this is nonsense. So that's all I'll say about that. I'd also add that unconscious experience is in no way intellectually inferior stuff. As Julian James, the author of The Origins of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, alerts the reader, there are many rather sophisticated things that not only usually go on outside of consciousness, but probably are best done outside of consciousness. So when we're not entirely conscious of things, we are weighing up difficult moral dilemmas. We are making decisions. We are solving puzzles or problems. We are creating things. We are falling in love. All the sort of things that are really important to our life are going on outside the Gorgon stare of the conscious mind. And it's also an important reflection that when you start playing chess, or if you're training as a surgeon or as a fighter pilot, a lot of what you do will have to be conscious. But when you get really good at it, it will move into your unconsciousness, and it will be superior coming from there. So, and unconsciousness is not a kind of consciousness that moths got into. It's actually the really important part of our awareness. A couple of nice things that Iain Whitehead, one of my philosophical heroes, said, that essays of consciousness are strictly limited in number. They require fresh horses and must only be made at decisive moments in the battle. And he also commented, civilization advances by extending the number of important operations which we can perform without thinking about them. So consciousness is one of those things that is immediately known, but not cognitively graspable. And one of the things I feel about Anglo-American philosophy is that a lot of it is so bad because alone in any language I know, we don't distinguish between two types of knowing by experience and knowing that something is a fact or not. And I think a lot of confusions come from that in the European and American, the English and American tradition as opposed to the European continental, so-called continental philosophy. And this applies to a number of things. Consciousness is one, that we have no cognitive grasp on it because it's element. Another is being, of course. Why is there something rather than nothing, of the fascinating questions. And the fact that there is intelligence. Why is it that the universe seems to be constructed in a way that is amenable to intelligence if it's an entirely random product of nothing that thinks or has any intelligence? The emergence of intelligence, if one can call it the emergence, and I don't believe in this kind of emergence, is a very remarkable thing in itself, but it's also an extraordinarily intelligent idea. That there should be intelligence already presupposes a kind of intelligence. So if that doesn't trouble you, you're not quite understanding the full import. Einstein said the eternal mystery of the world is its comprehensibility. The fact that it is comprehensible is a miracle. And that's not one of those attributed sayings. I can give you chapter and verse in the German for it if you want. Though I won't do that now. And David Deutsch, a modern philosopher, says it's rather odd that, as it were, wherever we go, we find that the world is understandable in our language. He says it's like doing space travel, and every planet you landed on, people came up to you and spoke to you in English. It's a very odd thing. So there are mysteries that are also so transparent that they're not a mystery. And they are things that speak of the nature of the cosmos, that it is conscious, that it is intelligent. And I should remind you that we may not see these things there, but the eye, the organ of sight, can see everything but itself because it is the ground of sight. Now, there is a very obvious close relationship between matter and consciousness. Lucretius was probably the first person to talk about this at any length. And nobody can deny that at any rate during this life, whatever it is, matter and consciousness are enormously closely linked, almost, not quite, but almost inextricably linked. But of course, the fact that there is a close relationship doesn't say anything about the nature of the relationship. And David's already referred to the radio set. If somebody from outer space were to inspect a radio or a TV and the workings of it, they wouldn't be able to tell whether the radio or the TV generated the phenomena that it showed or transmitted them. And broadly speaking, there are three ways one can think about the relationship between matter and consciousness. I call these the emissive, the transmissive, and the permissive. The least likely of these is the one that is almost universally espoused by modern science. At least at the moment, I have a feeling it's going to let it go quite soon. The idea is that matter that is wholly devoid of consciousness, according to this theory, can somehow produce consciousness. Nobody has the slightest idea, not even a vestige of an idea, how this could ever happen. And it has absolutely no intuitive appeal and no logical basis. Its appeal is simply the mistaken idea that matter is simple and we understand it. But I'm sorry, it's not simple and we don't understand it. And those are some of the discoveries of modern physics. Adam Frank, an astrophysicist in New York, says that a lot of philosophers think they're being terribly hard-nosed when they want to, as it were, reduce consciousness to something in the world of physical material. And when they come to physicists and try to discuss these ideas, he says the physicists look rather sheepish, stare at their feet and mumble something like, it's a bit complicated. So in fact, no physicist really has the slightest idea how this could happen either. I'm going to suggest that the transmissive and permissive, the idea that the brain transmits consciousness, or as I would prefer, permits consciousness, have a lot more going for them. And I'll say more about that as we go along. There is, however, a basic incommensurability of matter and consciousness, and it's been often referred to. So Charles Sherrington says that clearly there is a relationship, but for all that he is puzzled about it all his life long, he cannot see any way in which they can be connected. So if you're faced with this incommensurability, there are really 4 or 5 options that you can go for in trying to deal with this problem of consciousness, which, as I say, I don't see as a problem at all. The first would be to deny the existence of consciousness altogether. And that has been done, amazingly enough. To deny the existence of matter, to accept that they each exist but are totally distinct, to assert that they each exist but are effectively precisely the same thing, or to entertain the possibility that they are distinct phenomena that reflect different aspects of a nonetheless importantly indivisible reality. So I'd just like to say something about those possibilities in turn. Can we deny the existence of consciousness altogether? Well, as I say, this is the stupidest gambit ever put forward by intelligent people. There are people who hold down expensive university posts in philosophy who still pretend that consciousness doesn't really exist. The whole concept that experience is an illusion is entirely incoherent. For it to be an illusion, it would have to be an illusion in consciousness. There aren't illusions without consciousness. And as Galen Strawson says, the notion that you can have this is what it is, this is what it seems, as you can do in many discussions about the real world as we experience it, you can't open up the is-seems gap in the case of consciousness. If it seems in the case of consciousness, it is. And the idea that it can be discarded, he says some rather wonderful words. At this, we should stop and wonder. I think we should feel very sober and a little afraid at the power of human credulity. the capacity of human minds to be gripped by theory, by faith. For this particular denial is the strangest thing that has ever happened in the whole history of human thought, not just the whole history of philosophy. It falls, unfortunately, to philosophy, not religion, to reveal the deepest woo-woo of the human mind. I find this grievous, but next to this denial, every known religious belief is only a little less sensible than the belief that grass is green. Well, could it perhaps be reduced to something else? And here I think the best image is that put forward by William James, who I consider one of the greatest thinkers, absolutely the greatest thinkers of the last 150 years. Both a great psychologist, a founding psychologist, and a great philosopher. And he says existence and consciousness are not things that can partially come about. Things can't sort of partly somehow exist. They either exist or they don't, and consciousness is the same. Consciousness either exists or it doesn't. There can be something that is called a stage of preparation for consciousness, but there can't be, as he says, it can be nascent. But once it is, it is. It either is or it isn't. And in this he refers to the novel by Marriott, Midshipman Easy, in which a young woman has an illegitimate child, and in talking to someone she says, if it please you, sir, it's a very small one, which is, as he says, doesn't excuse the illegitimacy, and it doesn't excuse the illegitimacy of the idea that consciousness can arise from the unconscious by degrees. Nor can it in any other sense be said to be emergent. And again, Galen Strawson, who, if you don't know his work on consciousness, I greatly advise you to acquaint yourself with it, says, you know, people say, well, water emerges from H2O, but there is nothing about water that you couldn't deduce from the knowledge of hydrogen and oxygen and how they interact with one another, which would explain the slipperiness of water. He says, and this is slightly difficult because he expresses it somewhat algebraically, but just try to concentrate on this for a second because it's very good. For any feature y of anything that is currently considered to be emergent from x, he writes, there must be something about x, and x alone, in virtue of which y emerges and which is sufficient for y. And there isn't anything about matter on its own. And of course, once you import something else, then you've lost the idea that matter alone can give rise to consciousness. There's nothing about matter that makes one think it could give rise to consciousness. In fact, the philosopher Colin McGinn rather flamboyantly says, you might as well assert that numbers emerge from biscuits or ethics from rhubarb. And the great neuroscientists, V.S. Ramachandran and Colin Blakemore, very much mainstream, not known for their flaky essays into the entirely unwarranted, say in the Oxford Companion to the Body, consciousness, like gravity, mass and charge, may be one of the irreducible properties of the universe for which no further account is possible. And I'm not going to, because I don't have time, but I think virtually all great physicists since about 1920 have agreed with this, and some actually before that. There's a whole roll call of them, you know, Heisenberg, Schrödinger, Bohr, you name it, Planck. I won't go through it. Schrödinger says rather nicely, consciousness cannot be accounted for in physical terms. For consciousness is absolutely fundamental. It cannot be accounted for in terms of anything else. And the other great physicists have said something of the kind. And it's not just of a period. There are many contemporary physicists, Richard Conn Henry, Bernard Heisch, and so on, who have said similar things. So we can't deny the existence of consciousness, but can we deny the existence of matter? That's perhaps more promising. For example, I know that I have this idea that there's something called matter because of consciousness. I know that for certain. I do not know that I have the idea there's something called consciousness because of matter. I might, or I might not. Indeed, no one has ever seen matter. All we've seen is elements within consciousness to which we ascribe properties we call material: relative solidity, relative capacity to endure, elements that resist our will, all of which are very important. In other words, what we call material is adjectival, and the adjectives apply to elements of experience. F.C.S. Schiller, great turn of the 19th, 20th century Oxford philosopher, said, matter is a baseless abstraction, a metaphysical fiction designed to provide forces with a vehicle. But we now know that forces don't require some underlying sustaining vehicle in order to be real. Physics is largely composed of such forces. However, I would like to say we can't conveniently dispense with matter either. In fact, it's most unsatisfactory to resolve this problem by dispensing with either consciousness or matter. It provides the element of permanence and resistance in experience, both of which have enormous significance in the creation of a world or a cosmos. So can we hold that they exist, but are totally distinct? Well, this, of course, was Descartes' gambit and his problem, which remains unresolved if you believe they can't interact. But clearly they do. This is dismissed by modern physics. Clearly, consciousness affects the material world and vice versa. And it's also true in psychology, so that placebos and hypnosis can cause physical changes and so forth. So there's clearly an interaction both ways. Well, how about that they both exist, but are one and the same thing? And this has been tried by philosophers. The first great philosopher to try this was Schopenhauer, and it's not by any means a foolish idea. And an extremely, in my view, distinguished and not well known enough Swiss physicist, Carl von Weizsäcker, said that consciousness and matter are one and the same. But I think if you'd pressed them, they would have said that they are ultimately the same, but clearly manifest in different ways, just that there are no clear-cut divisions. And perhaps this is clearly the best gambit, the last one, that they are different aspects, different phenomenal aspects of a single underlying reality. And here I want to emphasize something very obvious but often overlooked: the importance of the difference between a distinction and separation. So we often feel that once we've distinguished things, they're separate and have to be joined, but this is absolutely not the case. Take the image of a whirlpool, which is one that I recur to throughout a very, very long book, as an image of what an individual being is. A whirlpool in a stream is there for a time being. It is distinct, it can be photographed, it can be measured, it has power to move stones. It's very real, but it is not in any way separate from the overall flow. In fact, for the moment, it is the flow at that particular point in space and time. So how can we think of the difference? And one image I'd like to throw out is that the phenomena may in fact be rather like water. Water has what chemists call phases, not temporal phases, but chemical phases. In one phase, water is transparent and fluid and moves around obstacles. In another, it's hard, opaque, immobile for all purposes, and hard enough to split your head open. And there's another phase in which you can't see it at all. So perhaps consciousness is like that it, as it were, congeals under certain circumstances and certain forces for a while into objects within the conscious flow that provide resistance. That would be a whole other talk, why resistance is absolutely essential to creation. There has to be an element of resistance for anything to come into being, but I can't go there. I'd love to give another talk another day about that. But of these elements, which is really the primary thing? Well, it's not just ice, it's not just vapor, it's not just sort of the flow. It is the primary water that underlies all three. And all physicists have agreed that consciousness is the primary phenomenon, if you like, that merges with matter. So Planck asked whether matter could emerge from consciousness, said no. I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. We cannot get behind consciousness. And Sir Arthur Eddington, it is the physical aspects of the world that we have to explain. So where does this consciousness come from? Is it something that emerged? I think we've decided that probably it didn't. So is it in everything? Well, this is pan-experientialism, and it is something, a form of which I would recommend. Of course, it offends common sense. Does a rock have consciousness? But in this, there's what I call anthropomorphism in reverse operating. And because we, with our consciousness, mow the lawn, go to Sainsbury's and have a beer, it doesn't mean that the mountain behind my house should mow the lawn, go to Sainsbury's and have a beer. What would it look like if it were conscious or weren't conscious? It would look like the mountain. And it's not really, we don't have, in other words, the luxury of common sense. Which is more bizarre, a sudden emergence or that it was there all along? It seems to me I'd go with the second of these as the more probable. And this is not a flaky new idea. It's a very ancient idea, of course, in Eastern philosophies, Eastern wisdom traditions, but it's also true of our own enlightenment. Nobody could have been hard-headed than Diderot. And this is a quote from Diderot, writing in the late 18th century, one of the great luminaires, the luminaries of the Enlightenment. All is in perpetual flux. Every animal has something of the human. Every mineral has something of the plant. Every plant has something of the animal. There is nothing circumscribed in nature. Each form has its own proper fortune or misfortune. From the elephant to the flea, from the flea to the sensitive and living molecule, the origin of everything, there is not a point anywhere in the whole of nature that does not suffer or take delight. Well, that is pan-experientialism. And indeed, there can't therefore be a hard and fast difference between inanimacy and animacy. And again, this is an excursus I can't go into, but the great philosopher of biology, Robert Rosen, turned around the idea that life is somehow an oddity in the universe, and said that actually inanimacy, if it did exist, would be the extreme case or the limit case of animacy, and that we should see things that way around. Now, of course, I'm a neuroscientist and a neurologist and psychiatrist, so for me, the brain matters. Are neurons necessary for consciousness? Well, consciousness seems to exist at the level of the single cell. Single-celled organisms can do all kinds of amazing things, solve thousands of problems simultaneously. And it has been said by many great cell biologists, including James Shapiro, again, a mainstream biologist, living cells do not operate blindly. Life requires cognition at all levels. And here he's with Barbara McClintock, a cytogeneticist who won the Nobel Prize, I think in the 1980s or 90s. She saw that organisms seem to know things about different parts that are not obviously communicated. But what is more fascinating is that intelligence, one of the definitions of intelligence, is that you don't just work according to a rote plan. You can solve a new problem that you've never seen before. Well, get this, and again, I don't have time to go into the evidence, but single-celled organisms and multicellular, quite primitive organisms like flies can solve problems that cannot be explained genetically or by anything other than intelligence. Well, people say neurons provide complexity. Well, of course, these single-cell organisms certainly don't have neurons. Slime molds can solve problems and escape from their containers in the lab. They often have to have the lids tied down, otherwise they get out and go foraging. And they can find their way through a maze like rats. And the slime mold has absolutely no neurons at all. It's about as primitive as life gets. So what is this story? I mean, one of the favorite stories, well, it sort of emerges out of complexity. You know, there's a lot of things going on with many connections. Well, neuronal complexity is neither sufficient nor necessary for consciousness. It's not sufficient because although the brain, the cerebrum, the new brain, the part that we think of as mainly our brain, has a staggering number of neurons, in the order of 26 billion neurons. That's nothing to the cerebellum, which has 4 times as many neurons as the cerebrum. And without the cerebellum cannot sustain consciousness. What's more, you might say, well, maybe it's not very complex. It doesn't have as many interconnections as the brain. Well, of course, as you increase the number of neurons, you increase exponentially the number of possible connections, not linearly. And also, Purkinje cells, which are an important cell in the cerebellum, are some of the most highly connected cells in the whole human body. So it's not sufficient. Is it necessary? Well, no. As has been demonstrated in some recent research, lesser degrees of connection, lesser degrees of complexity are often preferential. And there are processes that limit complexity and interconnection. And one of the most drastic examples of these is that you may know that you have more neurons than you have before you're actually born, when you're in the uterus. And you might think, well, a few neurons get lost here and there. Get this, at 28 weeks of gestation, out of 40 weeks, you have the most neurons you'll ever have. And by the time you're born, 70% of these have been lost. Not a decline to 70%, a decline by 70%. And then carries on through life and the pruning of connections and the pruning of processes in neurons. In a sense, every single cell in one's body contributes to consciousness. And so the idea that it can be located here or there or is due to any one particular nexus of complexity really doesn't hold water. Then there is the case reported by John Lorber, not a unique case, but one of the most beautiful because it's so detailed, of a man who, he had a patient who was, I think, 26, had a first-class degree in mathematics from Sheffield, an IQ of 126, but was found to have almost no cerebral cortex, no more than perhaps a tenth of what a normal human being would have, and yet functioned apparently entirely normally. And research in the literature shows that these cases are not that uncommon. In fact, a study of 4 patients who had a very rare condition called hydranencephaly, not just anencephaly, but hydranencephaly, which means a condition in which the cerebral hemispheres are very largely or totally absent, and the space is filled with cerebrospinal fluid. And these 4 cases demonstrated, this is a recent study in the last few years, that despite having minimal or practically non-existent cortex, they all nevertheless possessed discriminative awareness, they had functional vision, could orient themselves, could distinguish familiar from unfamiliar people and environments, showed toy preferences, could interact socially, could respond to and discriminate pieces of music, and demonstrated not just awareness of their own body, but appropriate effective responses to others, as well as associative learning. Well, what about creatures that absolutely clearly don't have neurons? What about plants? Well, there's a lovely story here, probably too long for me to tell, but just let me give a few glimpses. Plants have been described by a number of plant biologists as having intelligence and memory. In other words, they can solve problems that they could not be prepared for by experience or by a genetic phenomenon, and can remember previous events and interpret them in a way to modify their behavior. Plants behave. They don't not behave just because they don't move. Aristotle pointed out that there are 4 kinds of movement. Only one of them is locomotion from place to place. The others involve change in form and growth of form and so forth. Well, Mimosa pudica, the so-called sensitive plant, as you probably know, has a rather splendid mechanism whereby if it's touched, it closes. But this is an energy expensive thing to do. And if you carry on doing it, it stops doing it. Fair enough, you can say. The phenomenon fatigue. There's a concept in neurology called fatigue. If you keep on pressing a certain button, it doesn't respond so well. But if you've only ever used a finger, it will stop responding. But if you take the same plant and drop a drop of water on it, it will instantly shut. So it can tell the difference between the water drop and the finger. Let's take it a little bit further. With pea plants. Pea plants can be cultivated in a paucity of light, so they don't have enough light, so they crave light to grow. And light is provided at certain periods during the day. And if they're not orientated towards the light, they won't benefit from it so much. So a Y-shaped tube was erected over a bed of pea plants and of juvenile pea plants. And in other words, there was two arms to this thing leading to the funnel over the plants. And light would come on in one funnel or the other. And the experimenters decided that they could give a clue to the plant by giving a puff of air shortly before the arm out of which the light would come, and see whether the plants learnt that once there's a puff of air, the light will come down that arm and therefore grow towards that arm. They not only found that this was the case within several days, 3 or 4 days, they'd learned to make a connection that doesn't exist in nature, but also a control. Well, there were two controls, one in which, as it were, it was random, but the other one was a sophisticated control in which the puff of air came down the arm out of which the light would not come. And they found that those plants equally learned to go towards the arm out of which the puff of air did not come. That is in itself a remarkable piece of evidence. There's a whole lot more. Darwin knew that plants could make all kinds of decisions. In fact, his last work was on the nature of roots, which are almost like a plant brain. And bees, spiders can solve problems, have memories, can do simple arithmetic. Octopuses can make very significant decisions, including aesthetic decisions. Fish can associate things that could not possibly exist for example, if you give a fish an injection of something that sensitizes them to pain, and you put a pain-producing element into the water of an environment that in every other respect looks alluring to the fish, you'd expect the fish to go in there, but once it's been once, it doesn't go back because it knows that actually it gets more pain when it goes there. Crows can solve 8-stage logical problems, and crows and pigeons between them can solve, well, not between them, individually can solve problems that human children cannot, and in some cases are faster at doing it than human adults. And they have no neocortex at all. In fact, they don't have a cortex, and their brains are tiny. So why do we have brains at all? Well, my idea about this, and I'm having to rush through a lot of material here, is that this is how we relate to the idea of permission rather than blind transmission, that the brain doesn't exist simply to transmit whatever there is, but shapes it in an important way in order that something could come into being. And something can only come into being if something is resisted, rather as you can only have a sculpture if you discard the stone. You can only shape something if there is an area that is not included in the shape. And James, again, has a lovely image of this. He believes that the brain's action on consciousness is, as he says, like the vocal cords when air passes over it. If they weren't there, he would have no voice. But because of the being there of the vocal cords, there is his expression of himself, and that the brain is a way of bringing that into being. And this links to another fascinating idea, which is that inhibition is very, very important in the human brain. There are more inhibitory neurons in primates than there are in any other animals. And there are more inhibitory neurons in the human brain than there are in any primates. They are probably up to about 35% of all the neurons we have are saying no. And indeed, this is the relationship between the cortex and the subcortex, one inhibiting the other, the frontal cortex and the posterior cortex, one inhibiting the other, and I have argued between the hemispheres, one informing but also inhibiting the other. So a balance between facilitation and inhibition is a key to creation. You need both, but you do need the inhibition, the resistance. And this idea goes back to the 18th century, or the late 18th century at any rate, with Schelling. And in more recent times, it's there in F.C.S. Schiller, in James, and Bergson, who memory was not a device for perpetuating things, but for filtering out experience. Otherwise, one wouldn't be able to act. Max Scheler, a much too little known great German phenomenological philosopher, probably more brilliant than Heidegger, but died young, he had this idea too. And it's consonant with a phenomenon called terminal lucidity, in which when people are dying and the brain is failing, they seem to recover certain faculties. It's also, and actually that idea is present and known in many, many cultures across the world, and is found in the European sources back to the 15th century. And it's also consonant with the famous experiments of Wilder Penfield, who discovered that when you stimulate the exposed cortex, it can bring back memories that the individual no longer had retained. So they were stored, but as it were, inhibited. So why do we have consciousness? I think the question in brief is a mistaken question. It's not that consciousness is to our purposes, but that we are to the purposes of consciousness. That may sound a little mystical, but I believe with Whitehead and others, Collingwood and others, that the universe is, and of course Bergson, that the universe is a process of continual creation and bringing itself into being, in which it is coming to know itself through the evolution of the conscious cosmos with that other resistant element, which is the material world, and for a while we inhabit, we become part of that. So this is an idea, the universe coming into being and getting to know itself through the process of the consciousness that's in its other, in the sort of solid cosmos, as well as in the generative, overall, overarching one, the ultimate. This is an idea that is also present, of course, in great Eastern traditions. And if it is true, if it's a matter that matter is a product of consciousness, part of an intrinsically creative universe, the creative element of resistance, which causes things, becomings and processes to be precipitated out as differentiated entities in space and time, this requires no other purpose than itself. It is itself the purpose, and enormously richly purposeful, but not an instrumental purpose, as the left hemisphere would understand purpose to be. If this is the case, there is no sundering between consciousness and matter that has to be healed. They don't have to be stuck back together again. Nor is there any sundering between the positive, so-called processive part of the whole and the so-called negative, resistant part of the whole. They're not a duality, but complementary and mutually necessary aspects of the same entity, as the North Pole and the South Pole are indivisible aspects, though quite clearly wholly distinct in the magnet. And in this way, the one and the 10,000 things, to resort to a famous image from Chinese philosophy, can be seen to be one. There is both one and 10,000 things, but ultimately unity and division are unified, one of the core metaphors or ideas in my book. Now, if there's anything in this idea, it helps us approach some thorny questions differently. If the material cosmos is an emanation or projection of a grounding consciousness, it will, as a matter of course, have the necessary, apparently fine-tuned conditions to come into existence. It will necessarily have the qualities of order, beauty, and complexity, because it issues from a consciousness that, like us, is attuned to and gives rise to such elements. It produces conscious beings naturally, and the conscious beings will naturally be able to speak its language, since they are generated by it. So Deutsch's problem that the universe seems to speak English wherever you go, so to speak, is resolved. This doesn't answer the unanswerable question why there is something rather than nothing, but nothing does answer that question, although I have a stab at it at the end of my book. It can no more than postulate that the grounding consciousness is intrinsically creative and that part of its self-realization is the realization of the cosmos, something, not nothing. Now, of course, this is to make assumptions, but it is impossible not to make assumptions. The materialist position makes assumptions of its own in spades, illogical ones and all-pervasive ones. It just assumes that all is entirely random and meaningless. It has no evidence for this. It assumes that nothing exists apart from matter. It has no evidence of this. If consciousness exists, it says, it can come about secondarily at some point in evolution out of something fundamentally alien to consciousness. This is not only logically impossible, but again, there is no evidence for this. And it assumes that the order and beauty and apparently purposive drive in things cannot be explained, as neither can our capacity to appreciate and understand more than a very small part of them, and that these are all remarkable coincidences. So on either my outline or this one, order still emerges out of chaos, and things naturally complexify without outside intervention. The difference is that in the materialist paradigm, all that is inexplicable. And so is the fine-tuning of the cosmos, so that they respond by the extravagant postulate that there are an infinite number of universes on the basis that eventually one like this is bound to come about by chance. But by the way, there is absolutely no shred of evidence that there are any other universes, never mind an infinite number of them. And it is the reverse of the way in which logical propositions should proceed. Indeed, my response to it is, Occam wept. My last word, because I've just got 1 minute by my calculation from when I started, will be on, is consciousness individual? I think it is and it isn't. So while we have it for the moment, it is importantly distinct but not separate, to revert to my previous distinction. Distinguishing or differentiation. What William James said was that we are like islands that at the base are all connected under the water in the sea. The idea I like is that, for those of you who remember O-level biology, cells and organisms have what are called villi, which are outpouchings of cytoplasm, which enable them to do what they do. And if you were in the middle of one of these, you might well not notice everywhere you went, except one tiny little bit. You couldn't get out of it, you were bounded in it. But actually at the base of the villus, you are at one with the cytoplasm of the whole organism, or the cell in this case, but through it with the whole organism. So my view is that we are, as it were, temporary villi, outpouchings of the consciousness, and the purpose of that is to differentiate. The cosmos's whole aim is to bring into being new things out of the single one, not to just unify everything so that nothing really exists or can be differentiated, but to differentiate while remaining unified, and that we partake of an individuating, pluralistic, as James said, creative universe. So are we aliens in this cosmos? I think definitely not. And the idea that we are is a popular one, a romantic one, I suggest, but an utterly absurd one. People say, oh, we're at sea in this meaningless cosmos, trying to create a little bit of meaning or create a little bit of beauty. If we can create meaning or beauty, they must be potentially there in the universe. It is a fact about the universe which cannot be denied, a fact as good as anything else, that the universe gave rise to Bach's B minor mass. It didn't come from somewhere outside the cosmos. It came through us, out of the cosmos. So the cosmos has that all in it, and so do we. Thank you very much.
Iain, thank you so much. What a rich and comprehensive presentation. I mean, it's almost impossible to know where, as it were, where to start. But we do have some hands up already, but I just wanted to make one comment before going to the hands, and that's on your model, including this necessary resistance and shaping. And you didn't go into good and evil, but that's an implication of that, obviously, behind what you're saying, and the subtlety of the differentiation in unity and the unity in differentiation. And it struck me that you didn't actually mention his name, but that David Bohm, his view on this is very consonant with what you've been saying. Maybe just a few words on David Bohm?
Well, absolutely. And I find, I didn't come to these ideas through David Bohm, but I do find that David Bohm of all physicists is the richest, philosophically speaking, in having perceived these things. What David Bohm has perceived, or I should say what he has not perceived, is hardly worth knowing. And he, above all physicists, saw this necessity for individuation within union, for the element of resistance in the cosmos. And I do refer to David Bohm quite a bit towards the end of my book, but thank you for that.
And have you seen the film? Because if you haven't seen it,
I've seen it more than once. Yes.
Ah, good. Okay, excellent. Well, we had Jean. Your hand was up first, and so we've got a few minutes for questions, and then we'll spend a little bit of time in breakout rooms before our actual break. So, Jean, do go ahead.
Can you hear me?
I can.
Yes, thank you so much. That was wonderful. My own work deals with Vedanta, which takes the same basic view that you're taking as far as I understand it, but it looks at it from the inside, and there it perceives levels of consciousness from the matter through direct experience of whatever actually exists. And the work that I do, it's 5 levels. But the attitude that they take is that we create it out of our own minds. It's a projection of our own minds. Each of these levels that we see are actually emanating from the way we look at the world. And the interesting part is that in yoga or self-transformative practice, we can change the way we see the world so that we can see it as inert, or we can see it as creative, as deeply deep intellect, and onto a direct experience of whatever is, and that you can never put into words. So the point is, they put the power into our hands to transform ourselves and see the world in any of those ways, and indeed all of those ways, so that there's no break or any kind of contradiction, because it's all coming from our perception. So it's up to us how we are perceiving these things.
Yes, thank you for that. And of course, I'm aware of all that, and I'm largely but not entirely satisfied by it. I think the mistake people make is to interpret it as meaning exactly what you said, that it's all made up by our minds. And it's that I wholly resist. There is something that is there, that is real, and our perceptions of it are not fantasies. Our perceptions of it are not to be transcended. Our perceptions are partly created by us, and therefore I wholly agree. And at the beginning, very beginning of the book, in the very first chapter, I lay out a slightly complex finessing of the usual crude division into idealism and realism. I'm not a Berkeleyan idealist, and I'm not a naive realist. I believe that we participate in creation, and that what we bring about is a real part of creation that therefore matters. What we create with our consciousness actually matters because it is part of creation. And which way we decide to create it has consequences not just for us, but for the universe. In other words, we are partners in creation with the cosmos. And the cosmos is somehow vulnerable to that, which is also part of the greatest aspect of most religious myths. So while I sort of get what you're saying, and of course agree with it, I think one needs to finesse it quite a lot, so that one's not just talking about making it up or not making it up, but having a between us. And I know you didn't say that, but maybe we should ask someone else to ask a question, because otherwise we'll use up the
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. Iain, in the chat, we've got someone who said, I once heard Stan Groff say, the brain is a valve to the universe. Less brain, more universe. Which I think is an interesting observation.
Well, it sort of is and it isn't, because I say, again, you have to mediate between inhibition and creation.
Yeah.
And the brain is creating universe at the same time that it's molding and excluding. So the process of creation is always one of choice. It promotes one thing, but it's also, by that very fact, somehow retiring something else. So the brain is probably the greatest structure in the cosmos for helping to create, but also helping to destroy, because it's got to be.
we're so inclined to, you know, to go into these opposites, this binary thinking, and I love the way you resist that. Bernard, you're next up. This is our new president, Bernard Carr.
Iain, first of all, thank you for a brilliant talk. I've been thinking about matter and consciousness for many decades, but your talk brought out so many fresh thoughts. I just can't wait to read your new book. Now, I agree with nearly everything you said. I must say I disagree with the remark you made about the multiverse. As you may know, I'm quite an advocate of the multiverse. I know Ockham will weep, but I'm very happy to provide him with a handkerchief. But I do agree that there can't be an infinity of multiverses, but that's another matter. But in any case, that's not my main point. What I wanted to say was that I think there's one feature of consciousness which you haven't addressed, which is really fundamental. And that's as follows. It's all very well saying the one is the 10,000, you know. It's all very well saying we're all islands connected to the great ocean bed. But the real question is, given that, why am I one particular island? It's the problem of self-identity. Why does this universal consciousness, which must be so fundamental, why and how does it fragment into millions of individual consciousnesses? And I think that's the really important question. And I have my own view. I think it's all fundamentally connected with the nature of time. The question of why I'm me is related to the question of why is it now? I've no time to go into that, but I just wanted to say I thought that was the one missing element in your talk that you didn't address, but the rest of the talk...
That's very nice remark. I just can't let it go without saying I thought I'd addressed it actually as much as I possibly could in such a short space. My whole theme is that the cosmos is a matter of individuation, that its whole drive is towards differentiation, what James calls the pluralistic universe. And he says, if it were fine for everything to be unified, why would the cosmos go to such great lengths to differentiate itself? And that is the whole theme of that chapter, which I do address throughout the chapter. And I'm sorry that I didn't make it clearer when I was saying it. But it's the business of differentiation which doesn't destroy unity, but enriches it. It's like something that is unfolded and into all the parts, but the parts don't destroy the whole, but enrich the whole, so that it is now a more complex whole. And I just say that, you know, I'm mainly interested in the way the hemispheres interact to create things, that the take of the right hemisphere is in some way unpacked, explicated, to use Bohm's terms, and then it should be taken back into the implicit knowledge, the implicate knowledge of the left hemisphere. And I have a chapter on time, the drift of which is exactly that without time, there isn't the possibility for the creation of the individual things.
Thank you very much. And then we have Peter. So we've got President and our Emeritus President, Peter Fenwick, coming in from North of Scotland. You need to unmute yourself.
I thought that was a wonderful exposition. And really very clear. And I just want to take up one idea of yours, which seems to be supported in the idea of non-duality, non-dual consciousness. You were talking about the idea of the Vili and the individuation of people. In non-dual consciousness, you lose that. You in fact become one with the universe. And the descriptions of that state is that you are in fact the universe looking at itself, and you are the eye of the universe at that time. So these ideas go very nicely together. Of course, the path to the very wide states is going to be in steps. So you don't come to you being the universe and talking to the universe, which is yourself, immediately. That is through a process of experience. So lovely ideas. Why on earth do we do that? Because with non-dual consciousness now becoming really so common that one can understand the qualities of it, what has it got to offer us? Because we lose this resistance that you're talking about, because everything is in the moment, no time. Sorry, Bernard, it's gone. You're just in the present the whole time. And it is, in fact, the void creating, and that then goes back into the void again. And you don't have any time. There's no block of past, no block of future. There's just the arising within itself. I'd love to know what your ideas of that are.
Well, you know, again, I buy a lot of it, but I don't think that it's ever wholly collapsed, because that would undo the whole business of creation. The whole business of creation has to have an other. And this is beautifully imaged in the Kabbalah, in certainly the Lurianic Kabbalah, the story of creation, how things come into being. The first step of Ein Sof, the primary one of everything, is to step back. Its first creative step is withdrawal, to create a space in which there can be something other than itself. This is also the story of Christianity and of most great traditions, that there is something other. There has to be something other. And that something other, that space, is certain vessels appearance, and a spark of light comes out of Ein Sof. And even the spark of light, these vessels cannot contain, so they're shattered. But the great image, that's called Sheferat HaKelim, the following Tikkun, following Tzimtzum, the withdrawal, comes Sheferat HaKelim, the shattering of the vessels. And then there is a phase called Tikkun, which is repair. And this is a greater thing than before the vessels were shattered. And it is humanity's job to pick up shreds and shards from these vases, which contain sparks of light, and put it together again. So that you don't just, when people say all is one, I say yes, and all is many, now what? And I want to hold both all is one and all is many in a superior all is one. And that might answer your question. Yeah. In other words, there has to be the multiplicity and the unity. And there are two great Zen sayings that I always return to. Whenever anyone has a cut and dried idea about this, that it's all one, and much too simple for me, I say, yes, but. And the other one is not always so. Now, these Zen sayings should stop us coming to a nice, comfortable conclusion that we can just say non-dual consciousness. That's my take.
Thank you very much, Iain. I've got a question here from Jan Sisek, which is a very different kind of question, but I think an interesting one in our current context, and this is in the chat, about resistance playing a part in being conscious. Do you think that on the ground material level, actual people's resistance to government's infringement of our freedoms is a sign of people becoming more conscious? Another example of grassroots consciousness movements, a growing resistance towards the globalist UN Agenda 21. Resistance is becoming a kind of semiotic signal and a sign for being conscious. And if you're conscious, does it automatically mean that you're in resistance? Intriguing.
It's intriguing. I think probably I wouldn't go there myself. I think resistance, of course, in such everyday terms can be creative, but I don't think it's got anything to do with the sort of maturing of consciousness. There's been resistance throughout history, and I think it's always important and sometimes creative, sometimes very destructive. And again, I don't want it to be one or the other. It has to be capable of both, really.
Thank you. John M., you've had your hand up for a while, so do unmute yourself. And you were the one who talked about Groff, I think.
Yes, my question, as you mentioned, was I heard Stan Groff say, less brain and more universe. But it was really just to follow on and say, do you see that as a paradox? And yes, for us, in terms of self-development or intellectualization even, and spiritual development or awareness?
Well, yes, I wrote an article for the Journal of Consciousness Studies called Selving and Union, which was about the problem in mysticism of the being a self or not being a self. And my conclusion was that when you come to look at what most mystics say about this, they don't just simply say there is no self. In certain senses, there obviously is. And it's not an illusion that if there's just one great bean tin and I eat it all, you will starve. We are different. And our histories make us different, and that's the wonderful creative thing about the universe. We each have a unique contribution to make. It didn't go to the effort of creating individuals for them to deny their selfhood. What we need to do is deny our egotism, to deny selfishness, to create a self, not an ego in Jung's term, which is enriched through experience and senses itself as never wholly unconnected to everything else. So that's the way I take it, that the element of resistance creates the capacity for there to be many, many, many wonderful things that wouldn't have been there before, but are now connected. This is wholly positive. So negation can be in the service of creation. It must be there for creation. It must be there. And it doesn't disappear at any stage, in my view, any more than that evil finally disappears. My belief is that ultimately evil is taken up into good, in a sense that we can't in this life understand, and is somehow made part of the enriched whole.
Iain, thank you so much. What I'm actually going to do now, I know we've got another couple of questions in the queue, but what I'm going to suggest is those questions come up in breakout rooms, because I think it'd be valuable for people to have 10 minutes in breakout rooms, and then we'll come back at, I think it's 11:45. But before I do that, I'm just going to share my screen again. And I've got to find channel McGilchrist on my screen. Let me just need to. I thought it was going to be obvious, but it's not. Hang on a second. I'll just.
Can I just ask, David?
Yes.
You're not expecting me to be around after the breakout, are you?
No, absolutely. Sorry, I'm just going to go into this. If I go into that, then that will.
No, that's fine. I mean, one request I would like to make is, because I see there are vast numbers of questions that have been asked and not dealt with. Is there some way I can look at those concurrent?
Yes. So what happens is that though the chat is all recorded, and so we'll be able to send you the account of the chat.
Okay.
So here we are, share.
I'm not, no, thank you, that's lovely.
Yes, no, that's so this is just to give you a little insight into Channel McGilchrist. This is Iain's new platform. You can go to iainmcgilchrist.com, or you can go to channelmcgilchrist.com, and you can also see the dividedbrain.com. You can see the the film that was made, and just keep up with Iain's work. And one of the other things he's doing, and I haven't tuned into this yet, Iain, is apparently you're reading a poem a day.
Yes, I have been since, I think, March. And it will go on until a cycle of 365 poems have been read.
Wonderful. Right, good. Well, Andrew, Iain, thank you so much for, as I said before, an incredibly rich talk. And you've raised, a lot of people have said in the chat they're going to need to look at it several times in order to take the whole thing in. And you've raised a lot of fascinating points and given us really valuable insights into, I think, the most important questions that we can ask about consciousness and the relationship between mind and matter. So have a relaxing rest of your day. And I will now ask Andrew to put us into groups, and we'll be in touch very soon.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for your questions.
So Andrew's putting us into groups now.
Yes, thank you so much, Iain. David, just a quick point of order. We're sharing hosting duties, and you're actually the host. So I don't have breakout room functionality. You do.
Oh, good. Well, I don't know how to do that. So what do I do? Make you the host?
If you make me the host, then I can take over that function. Thank you.
Oh, right. So host me. And where are you?
Click on me. I'm.
Oh, Andrew Paulson. Right.
Yes.
Okay. So I think 10 minutes. Now you've disappeared again. Where's that?
On the more button.
More. Yeah. More. Make host.
That's the one.
Right. Change host.
Thank you. Wonderful. Okay. I'll open up the breakout rooms now. And
10 minutes of that, and then I think we're back at 11:45. So 10:45. Isn't that right?
11:45 is the next session. So yeah, it's about a 10-minute breakout room, and then we'll have a tea break at about 11:30 or 11:35, and go from there.
Good, great.
So 10 minutes, everyone. And if you don't want to go into a group, just don't say yes to the invitation.